Pues muchas gracias, bienvenidos. Ahora voy a cambiar para inglés. Hi to everyone, welcome to this starting session. A few weeks ago, José Manuel told me, hey, Julio, we have a problem. Maybe the Holger was not able to attend to this conference because he was going to have the shot vaccine about the COVID. Okay. So I have to think about someone to give this talk, and very quickly I start to think about Pamela. Why Pamela? Pamela studied some years ago sports science. So most of the people, or half of the people here, have studied sports science. But he has studied sports science with focus about economics and management. So the other half of this conference is about sports, economics and management, so it's a perfect fit. She is a great researcher. If you look to his curriculum, it's just great. She has close to 5,000 to 6,000 citations in Google Scholar. Her age index is 42, so it's something crazy. She is full professor in sports science, I guess, or in sport economics or sport management? Or...
Yes, everything.
Everything, so.
Sport management and sports economics.
So I'm sure that she's going to be a perfect talk to start with this conference. So, Pamela, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I will start now sharing my slides for the keynote presentation. Okay, can everybody see the slides and also hear me talk? Can you briefly indicate that this works? Okay, thank you very much. So on this slide, you can see our campus at Bielefeld University, where I have not been for a while. And I must admit, this is also my first virtual keynote. And I thank the conference organizers for the invitation, which I have accepted. Today is a public holiday in Germany, but as we all know, during the pandemic, every day is probably the same. My talk will be on the economics of environmental sustainability in sport. I have selected this topic because I thought we might also think about a slightly different topic that's always on the sports economics agenda. So I think we've already done a lot of research on how team performance changes, when teams change the coach, or we've also studied extensively the determinants of player market values and player earnings, and also why people participate in sport or not. But I think when the pandemic is over, sooner or later, there is another topic that will be back on our radar, and that is climate change. So I've decided to give a talk about economics of environmental sustainability in sport. My agenda is as follows. I will give you a brief introduction and a bit of a background information on climate change. And the focus of my presentation will be on carbon footprints in sport. And I will draw some economic discussions around the topic relating to the cost-benefit game of carbon footprints, and also some economic determinants of carbon footprint. And my talk will finish with some suggestions for future research. And my hope is that this might be probably a topic where people might be inspired also to do research, because we have some big questions to ask. And it's also that I feel that scientific research is the core driver of maybe providing some options and also some solutions to reducing the environmental impacts of sport. So let's start with the introduction, and it's about climate change and sport. I think we all know that there are issues regarding climate change and global warming, and we're talking specifically about the anthropogenic climate change, so about everything that is man-made. So it's climate change made by humans, made because of human activities, and one of these activities that significantly contributes to climate change is travel and transportation. And because this sector has a significant contribution to the overall amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's hence a driver of climate change. When we look at the relationship between sport and the natural environment, we can see that the relationship is bidirectional in nature. So on the one hand, the degradation of the natural environment affects the sports sector. So we've seen in winter sports that events had to be cancelled or postponed because of lack of snow or snow scarcity. We've also seen that outdoor sports events have been conducted in extreme heat. That was very challenging for athletes. So this is one side of the medal, and the other side of the medal is that, of course, sport also impacts the natural environment through emissions, because when we travel because of active sport participation, as active sports tourists or as spectators, then this traveling also causes emissions. So at the end of the day, sport and the natural environment have a bidirectional relationship. So it's important that we look at this topic. What is the meaning and the background of environmental sustainability when we look into the international world and also the international sports world? I think many people might have heard already of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and there is Goal 13 specifically stating that we need to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, and also sport and the sports sector is mentioned specifically as one area where we need to take actions to achieve the climate goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Also, when we look at the International Olympic Committee, environmental sustainability is also on the agenda of the IOC, and it will be a requirement for the next host of Summer and Winter Olympic Games to outline how the games are maybe climate neutral or how environmental impacts of the games are maybe lower than in previous years. Also, when we look at European football, which is heavily studied in sports economics, also the UEFA says on its website that it is serious about using the power of football to have a positive impact on global issues of environmental sustainability and also social responsibility in sport. So we can see that both the United Nations and also international sport organizations already deal with environmental sustainability, and the topic is on their radar. So since you know I'm from Germany, I will outline a bit the situation of environmental sustainability and how it is considered in German sports. So we start with professional spectator sports and a league that you all know, the German Football Bundesliga. And we've looked at the websites of Bundesliga clubs, and we found some clubs that actively take measures to reduce emissions, and they do publicly commit to climate protection. These are, for example, Wolfsburg, Hoffenheim, and Mainz. And on the other hand, there are also clubs that do not make any statements about the promotion of environmentally sustainable practices on their website. And I've also listed some names. So it's our current German champion, Bayern Munich, Leipzig, Leverkusen, and so on. But also the German Football League, which is the umbrella organization of the Bundesliga. So it's the governing body that is responsible for organizing the Bundesliga. They have implemented a task force and also defined the objective of reinforcing the commitment to ecological sustainability in the Bundesliga. And we all know that also the European Union, they have set time goals and time frames for addressing these issues. And I think 2030 is also a common year here. In amateur sports, we have the German Olympic Sports Confederation, so that is our national umbrella organization for organized sport, and they do also encourage pro-environmental behavior in sports clubs and also the environmental quality of sport. But it's rather, as you can see, it's broad objectives, it's not anything specific. In Germany, we've also, or the German government has introduced a so-called carbon tax this year. And of course, this tax will affect both. So it will both affect spectator sports and also amateur sports. So basically, based on the emissions that are generated, a tax has to be paid. At the moment, this is 25 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, but this price, the carbon price, will increase in the future. So after this short introduction on the relevance of climate change and also the relation to sports, the purpose of my speech is basically to introduce afterwards the concept of carbon footprint and show you some empirical evidence of carbon footprints in sport, then discuss a bit the cost-benefit game and economic factors that contribute to higher or lower carbon footprints in sport, and at the end of my talk I would like to outline some avenues for future and environmental research in sports economics. And I do hope that one or the other conference attendees may be inspired by my talk and maybe to do some research on that topic. Let's have a look at the carbon footprint. What is that? That's, I think, a concept or a term that is commonly heard in the policy debate, in the media. When we look at the definition, it can be said that the carbon footprint is the quantity of greenhouse gases expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, which are emitted into the atmosphere by an individual, an organization, a process, a product, or an event from within a specific boundary. So at the end of the day, carbon footprint is a global warming indicator, and the unit of measurement, as it is already noted in the definition, is carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, and you can see here the abbreviation for carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So, of course, carbon dioxide is not only the only greenhouse gas that is out there. There are other greenhouse gases, but the global warming potential of these other greenhouse gases is basically converted into carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So overall, carbon footprint tells you how much global warming basically all these greenhouse gases cause. I've put a picture here on maybe a footprint, and when you look at the measurement of greenhouse gases, so it's actually measured in grams or kilograms, so it's measured in weight, so it's actually more of a carbon weight than a footprint, because if it was a footprint, it would be measured in squared meters or something like that. So the concept and the name doesn't really make sense, but sometimes these things happen. So the name actually stems from the ecological footprint, but which is actually a footprint, but the carbon footprint is not measured as an area. So, but the concept of carbon footprint has made its way in the media debate and the policy debate, and it's a bit hybrid, and the wording itself doesn't make sense, but we have to work with it, and the term is there. When we do carbon footprint analysis, we have to set some specific boundaries. So these are the three boundaries that we have to set. The first is an organizational boundary. So we have to specify what object of interest we actually study. Then when we want to do a carbon footprint analysis, we have to set a temporal boundary. So set the time frame clearly of when we want to study carbon footprints. And we also have to set an operational boundary that relates to the different scopes of emissions, which I will show you on the next slide. So on this slide, we can see the different scopes of emissions, and they are maybe more or less prominent in the recent debate on climate change, but we have to be aware that there are different scopes of emissions. So we start at the bottom of the diagram with scope 1. So that these are basically direct emissions and everything that is resulting from on-site fuel consumption. So when you drive your car, everything that comes out of the car in terms of emissions, these would be direct emissions. Then scope 2 emissions are basically indirect emissions. So everything in terms of emissions that is generated because you purchase electricity. So when you do heating or cooling, like heating a pool or watering a tennis court, that causes basically indirect emissions. So the typical example is the water boiler. You know, what comes out of the water boiler is just water steam, so no emissions, but you need actually electricity to get the water boiler running. And this is also our discussion that we have in the public debate about e-cars and e-bikes. So with e-bikes and e-cars, the scope 1 emissions would basically be 0, but because they have to be fueled with batteries, and the batteries have to be used. So these are basically the scope 2 emissions that are caused. Then we also have scope 3 emissions, which are life cycle emissions. So when we think about tennis rackets or bikes, and also the batteries of e-cars or e-bikes, these would be scope 3 emissions. So everything that is caused in terms of emissions from acquiring resources to waste management. So these are the emissions. And when you now look at that graph, you can clearly see, well, people have no idea how many emissions using the water boiler or heating a swimming pool causes. So at the end of the day, what we can do in academic research and also in sports science and sports economics is basically asking people about their travel behavior and the distance that they have traveled and the transportation means that they have used. But many environmental offices, they provide conversion factors specifically for scope 1 and direct emissions, and we can use this information to convert basically people's information about travel patterns into carbon dioxide emissions. So when we want to calculate carbon footprints of sport, for example, every country has established some specific emission factors. So every country, every government does extensive research on transportation patterns of the population, and the German government does this as well. So on this slide, you can see that there are different transport modes, for example, cars, coaches, or long distance trains, or public buses, trams, and metros. And based on extensive transportation research in Germany, basically about the transport patterns of the German population, you can see that when one person drives 1 kilometer with a car, this causes 139 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent direct emissions, which is basically the unit of measurement of the carbon footprint. So basically, when we know the distance that is traveled and also the transport mode that is used, then we can convert this information into carbon footprints and actually also calculate carbon footprints based on these data. As another information, you can also see that there is an average degree of capacity utilization for these transport modes. So these are just the averages from transportation research. So in Germany, on average, there are 1.5 persons in a car. When you look at subways or trams, the average degree of capacity utilization is about 20%, so not that high. The same for public buses, but we cannot change these utilization rates. But these are the means that basically refer to these emissions factors. And these factors, they change every year because the Germans change their cars. So when you change cars and then the type of cars, of course, that also yields to changes in emissions factors. So these are all direct emissions, so the scope 1 emissions that I just mentioned. When you want to calculate carbon footprints, you could basically make an emission factor available in your country and then just calculate the distance in kilometers or meters multiplied by the emission factors, and that is how it works. But there are also carbon footprint calculators in the internet, and they can also put in the specific make and model of cars, so there's specific information available. Let's have a look at some empirical results. I know we have many sports economists and economists in the audience, so there will also be some regression models coming later, but we start with some descriptive statistics and some results from my own research on carbon footprints in sport. So a while ago, I've done a study on active sport participants, mostly in amateur sports. Sample size was of decent size, I believe. More than 7,000 respondents is what we had in the survey. And on this slide, you can see the average carbon footprints per year that were produced by one sport participant. So the average per person per sport was 844 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. And then you can also see which sports had higher or lower emissions. So when we compare individual sports with team sports, you can see that individual sports had twice as high emissions compared to team sports. And interestingly, nature sports, so actually sports that require the natural environment to be conducted, like walking and also diving and climbing and surf sports. So even these sports participants in nature sports, they had even higher carbon footprints. So that already tells you that there is something paradox going on here. And when you look at the different types of sports, so diving is leading the list here, followed by golf and surf sports. Ice skating is basically figure skating, and then you can have a look at the other sports. But you can clearly see that typically team sports tend to have lower carbon footprints than individual sports. Now you can wonder, okay, 844 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions, how much is that? And how much is it compared to the overall carbon footprint of a resident? So in Germany, the reference point would be that every German resident has a carbon footprint of 11 tons per year. So then everybody can do the math, and we can see that it's below 10%, but still it's a significant contribution to carbon footprint. To give you another reference point, in the UK, it's about 9-point-something tons. So my assumption would be that the Spanish carbon footprint is also within that area here. So we can say roughly a citizen, I would say, in Europe has a carbon footprint of around 10 tons per year. Now you've seen that golf was ranked second, and I also had a look at the specific carbon footprints by different types of participation purposes, and you can see that especially the carbon footprints coming from vacations do highly score and have a high contribution to the overall carbon footprint. So that is basically German golfers flying to Mallorca, for example, over the weekend to play golf, and that is how it contributes to carbon footprint. So there's not much from competitive sport. This is a rather low contribution. Daily training or regular training causes a high carbon footprint when we look at the carbon footprint for training over the whole year. But the significant contribution here is from vacation. So basically constant traveling because of playing golf, and also using the plane to fly to Mallorca and other places where it's nice to play golf. Then I've also done a study on the carbon footprint of sports spectators in relation to the football Bundesliga. So these were data from the last season in 2018-2019. That is basically the last season that was fully played, where all games were normally completed with full sides of spectators, something we do not really have in mind anymore, but that was the last season where this is the case. And on the slide, you can see the average carbon footprint of fans of specific teams. So it's per fan per season, and it looks a bit like our current football Bundesliga table in terms of sporting performance. So Bayern Munich is actually leading the table here, followed by Leipzig. Nuremberg is a club that has already been relegated to the second division, and the sample mean here is about 311 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So you can see that some clubs really do have smaller carbon footprints, like Mainz and Leverkusen. So the question is basically, where do these levels of carbon footprint come from? And when you recall the way how they were calculated, it's actually a matter of the distances and also the transportation means used. So when you drive as a fan from one club to an away game where your club is playing, you cannot do much about the distances, because the distance is just there teams are not moving in Europe. It's not like in the US, but the aspect that could probably be changed is the transportation mean. And we'll have a look at that on the next slide. So when we look at the carbon footprint, we have seen the average, and this average is a good measure because it also reflects the variety of attendance and travel patterns over the course of a season. In that particular year, the annual carbon footprint of a German resident was 10.4 tons, so it's about a 3% contribution. When we look at the average carbon footprint per fan per match, we have roughly 30 kilograms. A fan attends roughly 11 matches per season. So when you do an aggregate calculation and consider that the Bundesliga has 13.3 million spectators per year, or in that particular season, you come up with a very high number. So we have an aggregate of 370,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And if the German government said, hey, Bundesliga, we have introduced a carbon tax, you need to buy out of carbon emissions, then this would cost 9.2 million in total. Because, as I said, currently the price is 25 euros per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in Germany, but this price will increase to at least 55 euros in the next year. So here we do already have the economic component. So this is also why I selected the topic, because everything has an economic background. So also with environmental sustainability, all the discussions will also be always related to economic sustainability. And the German government has already related the two aspects together by actually implementing a carbon tax. And my assumption is that this will also be more common in the future. And all the discussions about protecting the environment, they do also typically relate to economic aspects, because economic constraints is typically a common factor why it's difficult to engage in more pro-environmental behavior. Let's have a look at the different transportation means, because as I said, the overall carbon footprint is a matter of the distances traveled on the one hand, and also the transportation means used on the other hand. And on this slide, you can see the extent to which different transportation modes have been used. So, for example, private cars were used to travel to about 36% of the gains, but they contributed 70% to the overall emissions cost. So you can see that this is really a significant contribution to carbon footprint. For trains, it's the other way around. The extent of usage was similar with 34%, but when you go there by train, by some form of public transport, all the train travel has a lower contribution to the overall amount of emissions that are caused. And of course, the ratio is even better when people use local public transport to get to the stadium here. So these are some first indications about football Bundesliga fans from a season that was still fully played. And we can use this information to say, okay, this is the status quo of carbon footprints in sport, but we can not do much about the distances, but maybe about the transportation means. So the general problem of sport is always that it would be most environmentally friendly if there was no sport. So if people did not travel to training sessions, did not travel to competitions, or did not travel to attend any sport events. But of course, this is not an option. And the goal of sports economics and in general science and research should be to provide some opportunities and maybe also some alternatives how environmental sustainability can be increased. After some descriptive information about the level of carbon footprints in sport, I would like to talk a bit about the cost-benefit game and what it takes that people showcase pro-environmental behavior. So let's have a look first at the definition of pro-environmental behavior. That is behavior that consciously seeks to minimize the negative impact of one's actions on the natural and built world. And the literature typically distinguishes between 4 types of dimensions of pro-environmental behavior. So on the one hand, we have nutrition, so basically eating and drinking. We have consumption, that typically relates to packaging and also the extensive use of products, or if you sell your products that you don't need anymore, maybe on eBay. So that would be the consumption dimension. Then, of course, water and energy saving. Do you let the water running while you're showering and washing your hair? So this would be something like that. Or do you shut off the light when you leave the room? And the carbon footprint dimension is basically here in the transport area. So we can say that the carbon footprint that I've just showed you can be considered one form of pro-environmental behavior, suggesting basically that a low carbon footprint would be an indicator of higher pro-environmental behavior. When we look at cost and benefits, I think that's a very economic exercise, that people look at the costs of an activity and the benefits, and it's a typical rational choice setting. So like in many other activities of daily life, a behavior is typically only performed when the benefits are higher than the costs. And the question is, why do people not engage in pro-environmental behavior? Because many say the costs are just too high. So and it's important to say that it's the perceived costs. So everybody has a different perception about these cost levels. And we do not only talk about monetary costs, we also talk about time costs, and also something like effort and convenience also qualifies as cost. So when you wonder why do people not use public transport to a higher extent, some would say, well, I find it too expensive. It takes too much time. I find it a bit inconvenient, and it just takes too much effort to walk to the tram station. So, and these are, of course, subjective perceptions, as I said. So every individual has a different assessment of the costs that are associated with a particular behavior, and of course, also of the benefits of a specific behavior. And the literature has also shown that when you engage in such high cost activities, so when you perceive basically these costs as too high, then you do not engage in that particular behavior because it just doesn't yield pleasure and it reduces your well-being. So when you look at the cost-benefit calculation and here at the perceived costs, people would say, okay, it's too stressful for me, it's too time-consuming, it's too expensive, I will not engage in that behavior. Looking at the other side of the medals, why do individuals engage in pro-environmental behavior? They would do that, of course, when the benefits are higher than the costs. What are possible benefits of pro-environmental behavior? One typical benefit is altruism. People feel good. That's the typical warm glow effect that we can see also when people are donating. They feel they have done something good. It makes them feel well. So doing something good for others, and that also includes the natural environment. So when you show some helping behavior, that's also similar when people volunteer. The mechanism would be altruism, and that is why people engage in that behavior. Also, other mechanisms could include role models. So people want to be a role model, maybe for children and other people. And also, in some cases, they get social recognition from performing a particular behavior, and that also relates to pro-environmental behavior. So actually meeting social norms and expectations is also a perceived benefit of engaging in pro-environmental behavior. And when we overall look at the literature, it's similar to the volunteering literature. So when we look at the reasons why people engage in pro-environmental behavior and why people volunteer, there are many common aspects here that we can find. Let's have a look at some economic determinants of carbon footprints. So of course, within carbon footprint studies, it's not only important to say, okay, this is the overall level of carbon footprint. We should also examine the factors that contribute to a higher or a lower carbon footprint. And I've just outlined 3 factors here. There are, of course, more factors, and we know in economics that we need to control for other factors when we explain an outcome, but I've just selected some core factors here. And the typical factor is environmental consciousness. So basically, the attitudes that people have towards a specific behavior, if they care for the natural environment. And actually, in many population surveys, a high share of the population always replies, yes, I'm environmentally conscious. I would consider myself an environmentally conscious individual. But the problem is, when you then look at the actual behavior, there's a specific gap for some people. So, but generally, many people would say, yes, I agree that I am environmentally conscious. So, based on the theory of recent action, attitudes are expected to translate into behavior, and you would assume then that environmental consciousness is negatively associated with carbon footprint. So basically that environmentally conscious people have a lower carbon footprint. Then coming back to the typical economic determinant, which is individual income, and there is also theory out there, it's referred to as the luxury good hypothesis, actually saying that pro-environmental behavior is typically costly. It costs money. This is why only people with higher income can afford it. And pro-environmental behavior is also an area where a lot of gender research has been done, and where many gender-specific theories have been outlined, like social role theory or ecofeminism, basically saying that women have a caring ethic, and that relates also to the natural environment. It's a bit related to volunteering behavior, and therefore women are expected to be more likely to behave environmentally friendly. So I do not want to walk you through all the possible determinants, but I've just outlined some specific determinants here, and we will now see on the next slides how they turn out when we try to explain the level of carbon footprints in sport. So looking again at some data, and finally you can see some regression models. You had to wait a long time for some econometric models. These models are from the study of active sport participants, where I've shown you the descriptive statistics earlier. And here the attempt was to explain the level of annual carbon footprint. Of course, the variable had to be logged because it was skewed. And I've just summarized the three economic determinants of interest here. So when we look at environmental consciousness, in green, the green color always shows that the effects are as expected, and the red color signals that the effects are not as expected. So what we can see for environmental consciousness is that the effect is as suggested. So higher environmental consciousness yields a lower carbon footprint. That is what we've seen here, but only in all sports. And we can see that the effect for all sports is actually driven by individual sports. And interestingly, in nature sports, so those sports where people actually practice sport in the natural environment, we do not see any effect. So that is a bit paradox here. So the gender effect is insignificant throughout, and also the income effect is either insignificant here or contrary to theoretical expectations here. So the luxury good hypothesis doesn't work here, because people with more income also travel more and have a higher carbon footprint. Let's have a look at sport club members. So the previous study was just about all sorts of sport participants, and that particular study here was about sport club members. And we looked at both pro-environmental behavior in the club and also the carbon footprint that is caused by traveling to weekly training sessions. And it's also, again, the yearly values. Here you can see, for example, that our environmental consciousness has effects as expected. But again, the gender effect and also the income effect are not basically as the theory would suggest. Looking at another regression model for the football Bundesliga data, where the dependent variable is also the carbon footprint over the whole season, we can see that that neither of these variables, so neither environmental consciousness, nor male gender, nor higher income had any effect on the level of carbon footprint. Of course, we've seen some specific differences for clubs. So Bayern Munich fans had a higher carbon footprint than Borussia Dortmund fans, and also Leipzig fans had a higher carbon footprint than Borussia Dortmund fans in the reference category. But for these other determinants that I've suggested earlier, we do not see any effects as the literature would suggest. What is a bit concerning for football Bundesliga teams is that fans who are more committed to the team, they also have a higher carbon footprint, of course, because they travel to more games. But as I already said, the carbon footprint is not only a matter of distances traveled and frequency, but also a matter of transportation means here. So to sum up, we've looked at 3 different determinants, and in terms of environmental consciousness, we have seen that environmental attitudes do not automatically translate into pro-environmental behavior in sport. So the typical theoretical assumption does not always hold, and researchers call that phenomenon the environmental value action gap. So why is that the case? It's because of the perceived costs that we've seen earlier. So the perceived costs are just too high in terms of not only money, but also time, effort, and convenience. And for the other 2 economic determinants, income and also gender, you could see that these general assumptions do not hold in sports. So I think there's some potential to actually find out and dig out the reasons why this is not the case here. So I think there's some research on our agenda here. So I'm coming to my conclusion in the last slides here, and based on my presentation, I would suggest that we have some big questions in sports economics to ask and also to study using our next research agenda. So one typical question would be that what suggestions can sports economics research make to reduce or to bridge at least the environmental value action gap that we have just seen? So what can we recommend that could be done to basically make people who say, okay, I'm environmentally friendly, that they also behave in that manner? Then we've looked at the cost-benefit ratio and have seen that this is also very determining in whether people behave environmentally friendly or not. So how can the subjective cost-benefit assessment of both sport participants and also sports fans be affected, that the benefits of pro-environmental behavior maybe also outweigh the costs at some stage? Then another typical question would be that we still do not know much about the environmental impact of sports. So which sports sector actually has a higher environmental impact? Is it elite sports with a few athletes and also some spectators traveling large distances, or is it the many people who are engaged in grassroots sports? We don't know that yet. And of course, another important question is how the overall environmental impact of sport can be reduced. And another question that I would also like to outline is how can we adjust maybe the schedules of events and league games that the overall traveling is reduced? And I will show you an example on my last slide here. It's an example from the Mainz Alpine Skiing World Cup, and we've heard earlier that also skiing and the skiing circus is affected by a degrading natural environment. There's lack of snow, so the ski sport is one sport where you can already observe the impacts of global warming and climate change, and the sport is really affected. And now we can look at the schedule. So that is from the 2018-2019 World Cup season. And you can see here the dates, and on the right-hand side of the table, you can see the venues. So basically the travel was from Austria to Scandinavia, then to North America, then back to Europe, to France, to Italy, to Austria, back to Italy, back to Scandinavia, then they travel to Eastern Europe, then back to Switzerland, again back to Austria, so it's now the third stay in Austria, then to Germany, well, at least there the distance is close. Then again they traveled back to Scandinavia, to Sweden, and then they traveled to Eastern Europe again, to Bulgaria, then they went back to Scandinavia, to Norway, and then to Slovenia and Andorra. So you can really see that this is probably not the most efficient schedule in terms of travel patterns. So I think for us as sports economists, there should be methods and ways to come up with more efficient schedules. And this is only from one season, from one gender and one sport. So if we are thinking about how can the environmental impact of sport be reduced without anybody losing anything, or without people being not allowed to travel, my suggestion would be that looking at the schedules of sport would be an interesting avenue, and one of the first steps that we might take. And I would also recommend that we as sports economists maybe also make some solutions in that regard. This was the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed the talk about ecological sustainability in sport, and I've tried to put an economic lens at the topic. Here is again the photo of our Bielefeld campus, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think we have some time for a couple of questions. I would like to say three quick things about Pamela that I forgot to say because the technical problems. She's on the editorial board of the main journals in sport economics, Journal for Economics, Sport Management Review, International Journal for Finance, European Sport Management Quarterly. I have an scholar article about her articles. Please don't do that, because you are going to be lazy, because every month I have a scholar article about a new paper from Pamela. And the most important thing that I think is she's a role model for all the researchers, but especially for the young female researchers that are starting her careers in sport economics or sport management or in a related field. Pamela is such a great role model for all of us, and especially for these young female researchers. So now the couple of questions. Anybody? If not, I have one.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. You have the application that is quite well. While some people, my question is about how is measured the carbon footprints for the estimate, because I guess this data comes from a survey, and if I make a survey about my carbon footprint, I don't know which is my carbon footprint. I know that I play table tennis, I travel about Spain sometimes, but how can we measure? I guess you have to fill some questions, and Excel or whatever tells you which is your carbon footprint, but I'm not sure, and this is my question. How is it measured, the carbon footprints from the survey?
Yeah, so basically, as you correctly note, people don't know what emissions they cause and what their carbon footprint is. So the only thing we could do is basically to ask for the distances people travel. So when you travel to your sport, I know the distance to your training facility. That is something we can ask in surveys. And you can also report transportation means that you use to go there. So if you use a car or if you use public transport. And then the key thing to actually estimate the carbon footprint is that you need to check in Spain. Maybe you also have a federal statistical office or a federal environmental office for these conversion factors. So every country has these emission factors. So basically, my assumption is that this is also available in Spain because it's also available in the UK and in France and in Germany and in the US. So you need to check the emission factors table. So the table that I just showed in my presentation that tells you when one person travels 1 kilometer with a specific transportation mean, like a car or public transport, then this amount of emissions is caused. So for cars, that was 139 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So you need to check if where that emission factor table is available for Spain, and then you can ask people in the survey for the distances that they've traveled and also for the transport modes that they've used. But you need that emission factors table, which converts the information that you can assess in the survey to the carbon footprint afterwards. Yeah, that is the key thing. You need to check, and that's typically available somewhere on the internet, but my Spanish is not sufficient. Otherwise, I would have compiled that and searched it up for the presentation here.
Thank you. Some more question? José Manuel, you have a question. I think that you are not able to hear José Manuel, but don't worry, I will translate you. Or maybe he can come here.
Pamela, I am José Manuel, and I want to thank you on behalf of the organizing committee and on behalf of the Society of Sports Economics for your availability, and because I want to thank your brilliant presentation. I think it's very suitable for this conference, and I think that is the best way to opening this conference. And thank you very much.
And your question is? Your question? You have a question.
I don't have any question.
Carlos Gómez has a question.
Thank you for the nice words. These are the best questions.
Carlos Gómez, which is with Helmut in Zurich, asked me about the football in South America. He said that there are large cities in South America with soccer clubs. Maybe this is an issue about their traveling and so on. Maybe there is no study about this. I don't know whether you know about that or not, or if you heard something about that, or...
Yeah, I do currently have a PhD student from Brazil. So he's looking at the Brazilian football system, and he's also done a study recently of the pattern football team in Brazil. And he also observed that there are some teams that have extensive travel to their geographic location in the country. And he has looked at the top through the lens of students. So basically wondering if it could be improved. Another option is, of course, to look at the travel issue from the perspective of carbon footprint. So we're looking at it in terms of emissions that are here. Into the Brazilian footprint system. It's done by my PhD student.
Atilano, who is a member of the local committee, asked about whether there are studies comparing a sport carbon footprint and musical carbon footprint, about the performance and the amateurs and other things, other kind of leisure, like museums or I don't know.
That's a good question. I think and this question should also be added to my list of big questions that we should answer in in future research. So basically looking at not only sport, but also other leisure activities like going to the theater or to the museum that also cause travel, and compare the different types of leisure activities. Maybe that's a good idea for a grant application. We are just at the start of environmental research in economics, and I think it should be on our agenda to compare that is caused by different types of activities. But at the moment, there are no studies developed.
So I think we are out of time. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your experience talk. At least for me, I heard about several things that I didn't know, and they are really, really interesting. So thank you very much. Keep in touch. And the last thing is that this hybrid way to handle the conference, I think this is the present because of the COVID, but I think it's also the future because this is much more easy to say something from the internet at your house than traveling to Coruña, and maybe you have decreased your carbon footprint because making this appointment, this talk from your house. So maybe it's the future.
Yes, thank you very much. I would, of course, like to come to Coruña in person in the future. It's currently a bit difficult because of the pandemic. But as you said, giving a virtual keynote at least has a positive effect on my carbon footprint. But of course, we cannot socialize and we cannot in person. That's the stuff. Thank you.
Yes.
Adios.